BloombergQuint. After studying select agriculture markets in Bihar, Odisha, and Punjab, a group of researchers at the Center for the Advanced Study of India, University of Pennsylvania, came to this conclusion. That when it comes to agriculture, and now I quote from the study, the idea that there are discrete low-hanging fruits that can be easily plucked through simple interventions and that these will result in significant gains in price realization for farmers is as seductive as it is mistaken. Well, to understand how they got to this conclusion, the nuances of each of the three markets that they study, and what light this research throws on the current debate around the three farm laws and the protesting farmers near Delhi, I'm joined by two of the four authors of that study, Shoumitro Chatterjee, the Assistant Professor of Economics at Pennsylvania State University, and Mekhala Krishnamurthy, Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at Ashoka University. To both of you, a warm welcome. Shoumitro, Mekhala, I'm going to throw the first question to you, and I'm asking you to make my job easier by summarizing the key, most relevant findings of your study, especially in today's context. Shoumitro?
Thank you so much, Mekhala, for having us. I just want to preface before I start describing the findings of the study by saying that when we started this project 2 years ago in 2018, these farm laws were not in the picture. So we were just a group of scholars coming from different disciplines trying to just understand how agricultural markets work, and especially in states where you don't have as strong regulations and you don't have a very strong mandi system, which is why the primary sites were Bihar and Odisha. And so in that respect, the study is more educative, it's informative, it confirms some of our previous beliefs, and it breaks other myths that we might have. So I just want to put that context out there for the study. So I mean, if you start by looking at Bihar and Odisha, the big thing that we find is that you have many small farmers, most of whom, it depends on the crop, but 40 to 60% of them do not have marketable surplus, i.e. they do not produce for the market, they produce just for self-consumption, as compared to Hoshiarpur in Punjab, which was kind of another district that we looked at, where most farmers were growing for the market, right? And so that is the context we have to sort of understand these states in. Then sort of a core part of our research was looking at how sort of the terms of exchanges were negotiated. And while we think that there are these APMC acts and auctions should always happen for price discovery, that was definitely true for non-MSP crops in Punjab, so like corn. But in Bihar, where you don't have a very strong mandi system, there are very few mandis from the erstwhile APMC markets. And in Odisha, most sales are farm gate, so farmers do not go to a quote-unquote market site, but sell at their farm gate to traders who show up at their farm gate. And the process of price discovery is just bilateral negotiation. There are no auctions that are held. And while I say that, and that might be a thing of not having regulation in markets, the other big surprise was how is payment done? Right, so farm revenues are right, prices and quantities, and the key thing to figure out is how we discover how much do you have to sell. And while in Punjab, where you have a very strong mandi system, payment was always manual, right? But in Bihar and Odisha, there was overwhelming majority of trade where the quantity was weighed electronically using electronic weighing bridges. Right. Then was the point about just looking at public procurement, which is the other thing. A lot of us think that there is public procurement everywhere, and farmers are able to sell at least paddy and wheat at the MSP. And while that was overwhelmingly true at Punjab, that was not true in Bihar and Odisha. In Bihar and Odisha, only about 5 to 11% of the farmers were able to sell to government procurement agencies at sort of a price which was the MSP, but you got certain deductions, and we can get into the details later if you want. But what was also interesting was the site at which the procurement occurred. So in Punjab, public procurement happens through the artiyas at the mandis, which is why mandis are so critical in Punjab. In Bihar and Odisha, you have procurement centers that is run by the state, and you don't have your artiyas who are procuring on behalf of the state, and it is the larger farmers who get access to the public procurement system on an average more than before the smaller farmers get access to. So the public procurement system, whatever exists in Bihar and Odisha, it is often very regressive, i.e. the larger farmers first get access to it. Then the second part of it was, do you want to come in?
Sorry,
were you asking?
Yeah, no, very quickly on procurement, I think it is important here, and I think this already will give everybody a sense of how much diversity there is. There is, while Shoumitro is absolutely right about sort of the difference between Bihar and Odisha and Punjab, there's a significant difference between Bihar and Odisha as well. Because Odisha over the last 15 years has invested quite significantly in its public procurement system for paddy. So it has an extensive network. Even then we found there was limited procurement. And as he said, larger farmers do have better access to procurement facilities. But even amongst the 3 districts we saw in Odisha, Sambalpur, which had a strong farmers union, a much more paddy production as well, had a better procurement system, more farmers accessing procurement than say Koraput and Balasore. So even within a state, you see certain regions benefiting more from procurement, and regions where you have strong farmers movements, where farmers are well mobilized, benefiting even more from those systems. So this is just to give you a sense that even within states which have relatively less procurement, there are differences, and Odisha is one state which has invested in decentralized procurement over the last 15 years. So we did see a difference there even between 2 states of a similar...
But Shoumitro, before I hand it back to you, I want Mekhala to clarify one thing, both for me and for the viewers. When you say public procurement, I'm going to ask you a really simple question, Mekhala. You mean this is the government purchasing not just wheat or rice, but other crops as well at MSP or close to MSP. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the government has a system where they announce MSPs for 23 crops. Right. The overwhelming priority for procurement, and one has to understand the announcement of an MSP only works when it is backed by public procurement. Otherwise, Absolutely. It's just a number. So the government primarily procures in the food grain category wheat and paddy. And then paddy goes to mills and then comes out as custom milled rice. And so the procurement, when it happens directly from farmers, is of paddy. These are government procurement centers. As Shoumitro said, in Punjab, it's done in the mandis, and the government procurement centers in other states procure paddy at that MSP date.
So when we talk about public procurement, and to the point that you made about public procurement and where farmers are organized, we're still restricting our conversation only around paddy and maybe sometimes wheat, depending on which market and which state it is. We're not going beyond that at all, right?
Correct. So
I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, so paddy and wheat is bought in Punjab and Haryana. And then Madhya Pradesh has wheat. Odisha, Chhattisgarh do a lot of paddy. Some parts of MP do paddy as well. I do want to say that under the decentralized procurement scheme, Odisha is one state which has started procuring millets. For the first time. So we did notice in Koraput district for the first year, and it was a tough year to do procurement for many reasons, and it was just a beginning exercise, but I think that marks a very important move where the state is realizing that for its state, it is much more important to look at other crops as well. And Odisha is one state that is looking at diversified procurement, beginning to pick up some millets, maybe some pulses, and this is the first time they've actually put millets in their ICDS program. So through decentralized procurement. And I think as we look ahead to the future for possibly MSP and procurement reform, these kinds of state level experiments are very important.
Okay, glad. I'm going to remember the phrase state level experiments. Shoumitro, I'm going to chuck it back to you now to complete your summarization of the findings of the study.
So just to add to the public procurement thing, the third thing where there isn't public procurement, but you have to buy it at a fixed price is sugarcane, which we sort of saw in Hoshiarpur. And the last thing, and I want to sort of end there, and then we can go into details, is about the evolution of the market structure and intermediaries in these states. Our sort of main finding was that you see a system of intermediation that has evolved conditional on the production systems of the local regions, right? So in Bihar, for example, you have a complex set of intermediaries offering different services to farmers. So at the village level, you have the small trader who goes around in a tempo, procures, buys whatever the crops from the farmers, and then moves it down the supply chain. He would then sell to a larger intermediary who would then probably sell to a miller or a processor. And then when you have mandis, you also have commission agents and brokers. And although they may not be sort of directly dealing or handling the produce, what they might be doing is solving a very key problem, which is counterparty risk, which is when I sell to an unknown trader, how do I know that 2 weeks down the line I will actually get paid? And this guy here solves that problem. The big surprise that we found was that in Bihar and Odisha, we did not see any evidence of interlinked transactions, right? So this is the old thing about Indian agriculture.
What do you mean by interlinked transactions?
Where sort of there is an intermediary who gives me credit to grow my crop, and then after harvest, as a farmer, I don't have the choice of selling to anybody else, but I have to sort of sell to this guy. While this is sort of true in Punjab, where even for sales to the government, the initial credit might have been given by the Artiya, and then I sell to the government via this Artiya. We did not find enough of an evidence for this in Bihar and Odisha. But the layers of intermediation that we saw in Bihar and Odisha, each of these small sort of intermediaries, they were solving an economic problem. It could either be of transport, it could be of quality assaying, right? So when a distant buyer is trying to buy my produce, there is no credible way to signal what quality my wheat or paddy is. And then he relies on somebody else on whom he knows and trusts to relay what that quality is. And that is the economic problem that those guys are solving. So those were kind of the broad outlines of the study, and I guess we can go into the details wherever you want.
Okay, I do want to also add, hedging risks and what conclusions you all arrived at that. A couple of other short, small points that cash continues to dominate electronic sales. Auctions are small. Right. You made part of that point already. That investment in post-harvesting processing is limited. You spoke of instances where farmers were investing in drying, but not necessarily in anything else, definitely not in storage, I mean, the new market infrastructure under ENAM in many of the markets that you studied is still lying unutilized. And we'll come to the relevance and the conclusions drawn from that. But Mekhala, you mentioned state-level reforms, right? When you were talking about the decentralized procurement by Odisha for millets or some of the other crops. My question to you is this: the three farm laws that are currently under scrutiny right now and at the center of a lot of controversy, the broad intent, stated or unstated, is to create some sort of national market that will help create multiple buyers, more competitive price discovery, therefore a more prosperous farmer, maybe even whilst controlling prices to some extent to the consumer, because it hopes to take away all the cesses and taxes being levied in between. And then, of course, there are the narrower issues of, the center pays a very high cess or other levies when it procures through FCI from states like Punjab, which it wanted to change for a long time and wasn't able to do so directly. And so through these farm laws, it might be able to actually, implement some of those changes. But can a top-down effort work? That's my big question to you.
So let me take this in three parts. The first is, Shoumitro mentioned all these variations, and yet we talked a lot about paddy and wheat. One of the other very striking things about research across these 7 districts, 3 in Odisha, 3 in Bihar, and in Hoshiarpur, which is one of the more diversified districts of Punjab. In Hoshiarpur as well, along with wheat and paddy, you will see maize, you will see potatoes, you will see green peas. In Sambalpur, you will see chilies alongside, red chilies, green chilies in Balasore. In Koraput, literally every block had a different cropping pattern. And, there was a major market for ginger. In Samastipur, you have very dynamic horticultural market. Purnia is the largest, very growing market for maize and has gulab bagh. I mention all this because we tend to focus a lot on paddy and wheat. And while this is very significant for Indian agriculture is also diversifying and has diversified over the decades as well. So what you do see is very, very complex cropping patterns and multiple kinds of supply chains, right, and commodity networks. And what you see is the same crop doesn't go through a common commodity network. There are different networks in different states. The different crops in the same state go through different networks as well. So this is the diversity that, I think anybody who goes to the field immediately sees in Indian agricultural markets. This is the reason that primary agricultural marketing has always been a state subject. And the understanding, I think, even in the constitution, was that marketing is very close to agricultural production. It's the first transaction, it's the sale that the farmer makes. And therefore, in order to be able to actually, look at this kind of variety, it needed to be state specific, which is why you've also seen the evolution of very, very different marketing systems across different states. The second point I think that's very important for your question is that we already have a national physical market. One of the most striking things about doing research in Odisha, for example, is that seasonally, traders will materialize from Bengal. They will materialize from Chhattisgarh. You will come from Andhra. In Balasore, there's also an interesting network of prawn export that is happening. The beetle wine from Balasore goes to Bombay, it goes to Delhi. So does green chili. All of this is moving. And our researchers had to spend time in Azadpur to understand what was really going on with the chili market in Balasore in Odisha. So I think we must first understand that we already have a national market. Most of the food that all of us eat in Delhi doesn't come from anywhere in this state, and it moves. So the question has been about barriers to trade and movement and how those can be smoothed. So I think when you have multiple states with different regulatory regimes, I think this has been discussed for quite a long time that there is a need to have various kinds of interstate mechanisms for negotiation and allowing better movement of trade, right? So states may have different kinds of policies on exports, on imports from within their own state. There may be different taxation. There has been an effort to have a single point of taxation. And these were all elements that were being negotiated. But I think in the context of India and a federal system, you would need the states to buy into the system. So even with ENAM, it is not about, ENAM imposing itself on everybody, but states have to sign on to and integrate themselves within the system, right? And that I think is a crucial thing, and you cannot actually do it without. And having said that, I do think it's important that many states have already started the process to liberalize their markets over many years. So we know.
So Mekhala, sorry to bring you back to the point though. The effort of the central law, at least one of them, is to no longer go down the route of the model APMC Act or the model any act from the center, which then the states can adapt to their own local variances and implement. The effort of the central law is, and on under the protection or under the argument that trade and commerce is can be legislated upon by the center, is an effort to create a sort of remove barriers to trade and create a seamless national market, if one may call it that. Can that work, given the complexities you've seen at the local area? Can it be at least a facilitator, or do you think even that might be difficult?
Yeah, no, so I certainly think there is plenty of scope for facilitation and for consensus building and for states to come on board, right? After all, they have an interest in their produce moving.
But there was no consensus building in this case. So again, I'm asking,
exactly.
This law, the way it's passed?
So I think what you've seen happen over the last few months is states have actually hardened their positions. Some states have actually said we will not let produce come from other areas into our states. Others have said we will declare the entire state to be a market area, like Punjab. Rajasthan has said warehouses will now be considered into market areas. So instead of actually having more clarity, you are actually seeing greater regulatory fragmentation. Now you have different regimes, some coming under state acts. These are different state acts, and then certain areas called now trade areas. You see a territorial competition between center and state to command more of this area. This is very counterproductive. It's counterproductive for farmers. We've actually seen more states declare that they will not allow produce to come from other states into their states. Right, Madhya Pradesh very recently said it, but we saw Haryana say it at one point, and then quickly correct to say that we meant they have to be registered in our state. But these are all actually impediments, right? It goes against the spirit of the idea that there should be greater movement of produce. And I think this is what happens when you don't take states along into the process of actually managing what are the single most important, economic and livelihood sector, right, for them. So I think that this has never happened before, and it's a historical thing that, and I think I want to make one other quick point, that there is a difference between trade and marketing in the way in which law has always been understood, right? So interstate trade was always of secondary produce that had already been bought in a market. Whereas marketing and markets and fairs were seen as the primary produce markets, and those came under state laws, right? So I think everybody can understand that negotiating a common market, and we know this with the recent experiences and with Brexit that all of us have been thinking, negotiating a common market is never easy. Whether it is, and in a federal union, it's a complex task. I think there needs to be some sort of institutional mechanism, right, by which states come on board into these processes. Okay, there's one other quick point. I guess,
Mekhala, I'll interrupt you because I do want to get to the issue of APMCs and their deprioritization, because you all studied very contrasting states. Shoumitro, can I come to you to talk me through what you witnessed? Because Bihar did away with its APMC Act altogether in 2006. That's not the case in Odisha. RMCs still function there. And in Punjab, most of the trade is APMC dominated or MANDI dominated, if I may call it that, because, MANDIs, which are an outpost of the APMC. So did you find that if the APMC were to be deprioritized, as these central laws seek to do, that competitive private markets will come up that will do as much as the APMC was doing, and maybe even in a better fashion?
I think there are three, I think you raised sort of 3 points which need to be looked at separately. First is, and Mekhala might have a different opinion on this, I am not sure whether the laws as they are stated deprioritize the APMCs. I think deprioritizing the APMCs is a little bit on the states themselves. So if the states want to invest into the mandis, they can still do so. And we have to kind of go back and ask, before these laws were in the picture, the states that were collecting revenues, right? So Odisha was collecting mandi taxes. Was it using those taxes to develop marketing infrastructure? And the answer is that it really depends on the state. Some were doing and some were not. So what we see in Bihar and Odisha is, so in Bihar, for example, we did not find, let me put it this way, that big corporates enter and set up private mandis. Of course, you saw the evolution of private marketing places. So this could be things like local hart. The sort of the large farmer of the village might have given his land to set up a place where buyers and sellers of produce could come and negotiate with each other. But of course, he was earning the rents for that, for creating that focal marketplace. But if the question is that, do you see in sort of a meaningful sense, large players enter and buy directly from farmers? In Bihar, we did not. The key market sites in Bihar are still some of the erstwhile APMC mandis of Bihar that serve as focal points where farmers or big trade, mostly sort of trader to trader, who traders would bring produce from different villages and sell to other traders who might actually be coming from Delhi and other areas for vegetables and so on. Odisha is different, right? So in Odisha, what you call the rice marketing committee or the rice marketing center is essentially a procurement point for the state. So those are places where paddy would be exchanged, but the state is buying at quote unquote again MSP. Other goods are not traded in RMCs. They have their own supply chains. Farmers sell it overwhelmingly, as I said, at the farm gate, and then depending on the commodity, it would take its course. But again, in terms of private trade, like one big example that we saw in Odisha was prawns in a belt in Baleshwar near the coast, but that was sort of driven by external demand, right? So there's this shrimp story in sort of the early 2000s. There was a disease outbreak in the Thai shrimp, and sort of Indian processors saw this opportunity. They sort of helped the farmers convert their paddy farms into prawn farms. They provided them with all the inputs and the technical know-how. And as of today, India is the largest exporter of shrimp in the world. So that was the kind of the big sort of corporatization story that we saw.
But not in ordinary agricultural produce. You didn't see any large at scale, let me put it that way, because scale is the word that I assume these laws want to achieve. At scale markets, private markets that could give farmers better terms of trade, or more competitive pricing, or any of that, either in Bihar, which has done away with APMCs, or in Odisha.
Yeah.
So I want to be careful and say that in Bihar, I feel that the pricing is competitive, right? You have a lot of private actors who are small, who compete with each other to give farmers a price, right? So the point is, when we talk about farmers' profits, they can be high either because prices are high or because they are producing a lot. And I think there's the issue of scale not only on the processing and marketing side, there's also issue of scale on the farming side.
If I
can, Mekhala, I'll come to you in just a bit. I just want to ask one more follow-up question, if I may, to Shoumitro on this very point. So maybe I'm using the wrong word when I say deprioritization of the mandis, because yes, the laws don't say anything about that. But in seeking to create these non-APMC, non-mandi markets, where there would be no levies and cesses, which would obviously be so much more attractive to buyers, and therefore be, this kind of effort to shift a large part of the trade that's been going on under the APMCs outside of the APMCs, and in restricting the area of the APMCs to the APMC and the yards. The truth is that these laws do, if not in word and directly, they do make an effort to create a parallel market. And if already states which have APMCs, like Odisha, have not necessarily invested enough in them, if they start seeing trade move outside the APMC, Shoumitra, the investments will further reduce. The role that the APMC plays as, in price discovery or in counterparty risk or any of those roles, will the private markets be able to take that over?
So I think we have to ask what regulation can do and what regulation cannot do. I think as far as the question of providing farmers with different options is concerned, so in states where there was, let's say, over-regulation, where obtaining a licenses to conduct trade in that state was held up because of cartelization and so on, that is the only thing that regulation can solve. Other than that, you really need investment. And that do not encourage investment in any sense. And that is what is required, right? So in Odisha, where you don't have mandis, there's no question of the trade going outside the mandis. You really need investment in supply chains. And I think the question we have to ask is, who is going to do that? I mean, again, this is my personal opinion. I don't see how the laws themselves are going to make private sectors invest. So if we ask, why is the private sector not investing in the first place? And let's suppose the answer to that question is, it could be because the scale of farming in those states is too small. So if that is the constraint and not regulation, which would be the sort of the case that would be coming out of Bihar, where you haven't had regulations in 2006. Again, deregulation in those states may not encourage investments. Of course, there might be other states where over-regulation might be preventing entry of private players, and you might see a different response.
Okay, Mekhala, how do you view what you think these laws seek to achieve, what they really will achieve, given the experience you all have had in these various markets?
Yeah. So I just want to, just picking up on what Shoumitro was saying, I think what you see in Bihar and in Odisha across commodities, except for a small amount in paddy, are overwhelmingly private markets. They are not regulated markets, they are private markets. And they're run by private actors. The question is, when we think about the private sector in India, we tend to think about the corporate sector.
Correct.
We don't think, they're all private. So there are people who have invested. They have invested in small transport vehicles, they've invested in drying sets, they've invested in small processing plants. And I think we need to have an imagination for the sector that also takes small and medium-sized enterprises seriously, because they are the ones who actually operate in this space. And they are very important. We tend to treat them all as intermediaries and as small-scale units, which they are, but they are the ones that have persistently existed in these sectors, right? Even if you look at mills, small, warehouses, all of them are with small actors.
And they should get a leg up, right? Thanks to these laws, because, these laws help enable more robust private markets versus the APMC domination in certain states. Is that fair?
Not really, because these laws in Bihar existed before. This was all open playing field. They didn't give them a leg up. It meant that they actually, they don't get formal credit as much as they should have. They were dealing with risk mitigation. So in Purnia, for example, we saw many cases where warehouses were on fire. They would have accidents and fires. And this causes problems, right, for small entrepreneurs, but it also finds its way into prices across the market. Now, when those kinds of things happen and you don't have risk mitigation for any of the actors in a chain, right? And again, as Shoumitro said, that's investment. That doesn't come by legally deregulating a sector. That comes from investing in a sector.
But what will help what will help foster that investment? Is deregulation maybe the first step? And maybe these laws should have been accompanied by, let's say, more steps at the same time, or maybe those will come progressively?
Yeah, so I think this is part of the big challenge, right? We have tended to do very piecemeal reform at best in agriculture. We don't come to agriculture with a vision for a sector which we see as a driver of growth and a multiplier of growth and development in India. And if you don't come to it with that, right, then you're going to continuously fail people. And that's what happened. If you look at what has happened in Bihar, I also want to point out that Bihar has had a remarkable story with maize. But, from 2010-11, when we've been doing research in Bihar, Cargill did not buy directly from farmers. Cargill buys in Bihar, Godrej Agrovet buys in Bihar, big companies buy, but they buy not directly from farmers, but from larger actors who aggregate and trade and wholesale in the market, right? So it's not like the private sector doesn't buy. In Samastipur, we did see a wheat contract was created with ITC that had already come, this was last year, 2 years ago. So again, it's not come as a result of the laws. And so you see private actors in many markets across this country, again, 22 states, have allowed private sector to come and take licenses outside the mandis. So yes. My work in this field began in 2008 when I started studying mandis in Madhya Pradesh, and ITC had already been buying there for several years in privately set up chopars outside the mandi. right? I think we need to look at states like Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka alongside, where they have invested in strong mandis, but also allowed private actors to come outside. And what you see there is when you have a strong mandi, farmers have genuine choices. They can sell in the mandi, they can also sell outside the mandi. And when the private procurement company, for example, buys in the post-harvest season for 2 months or 3 months and then stops purchasing, farmers who have saved their produce to sell later can then still have a mandi to sell it, right? So the idea is to have multiple channels that are multi-buyer and at the heart of the setup have strong price discovery markets like well-regulated mandis so that they provide farmers benchmarks, right?
Do these laws help that happen conceptually or structurally?
So structurally, they don't. And the reason they don't is because they create regulatory fragmentation. Rather than creating a comprehensive regulatory system where you allow multiple markets to exist, to compete, for the state to figure out what its priorities are when it comes to taxation and other things, you have now created a confusion where people are not sure exactly how to operate. One is a deregulated, relatively free trade zone that you've created around mandis, others have other rules. It actually makes it harder for all private actors, right, to operate in these markets and to figure out what is legal. And I don't think this kind of regulatory ambiguity is good for private trade at all. I also want to point out that these private markets that we found in Bihar and Odisha also charged, right? They also had fees and taxes. They were just privately taken by the people operating those mandis. Commissions were charged, gadedars charged commission. There were local.
It's almost, isn't it almost utopian to think that people are all going to go to the farm gate to buy? You can't disintermediate agriculture. Has there any country as complex as India, its size and scale, managed to completely disintermediate agriculture?
No, and I think what our research shows, but research from many other people as well, is that disintermediation is usually a misguided goal. What you want is more competitive, better regulated markets, right? For farmers in these markets where they are price takers, what they want is good venues for price discovery, for basic elements of the trade, which means for weight, for payment, for disputes to be well, taken care of in a good framework. And in a spot market, it needs to be something that's timely and where, farmers can actually access those systems. You want those so that then you have benchmarks to bargain outside as well. And that will, you want intermediaries to compete. So if you have 3 or 4 intermediaries, what you want to make sure is that there are not adverse barriers put up so that people cannot enter the market, right? So in fact, we had 2 examples in Odisha from our work. One where a company came and offered good prices for chili for 2 years running, and then in the 3rd year ran away, right? It just disappeared.
Why did it disappear?
There was a
Any idea?
It was a Ponzi scheme. The government then went after them. The farmers hadn't been paid. There was no mechanism to get the farmers the money that they were owed in the 3rd year.
This was in Odisha. This was in Odisha,
and we sort of talked about it in the chili market. There's a chapter called "The Tale of Two Chilies," and where we look at green and red chili, and there you see this story. It was very difficult. In another place, the intermediaries in the chili market were extremely strong, very dominant local intermediaries. And farmers actually reached out to the government system saying, can you actually create a mandi? Can you actually come and give us a better marketing site, right? And this was also not possible, because the government didn't have the kind of capacity and wherewithal that it needed to be able to do that. So I think what farmers want is better, well-regulated options. And they're anyway dealing with private markets, right? These are not farmers protected by government procurement and the state. Strengthening their terms of engagement requires investing in the larger economic market, investing in the processes that they can actually access, and investing in these kinds of market sites. And one last point we did see in Bihar, although Shoumitro was quite right that the states hadn't done enough before, since the repeal of the APMC Act, the investment in physical mandis, the deterioration in market infrastructure was very stark. So market sites have become far, far worse because there's been no public investment and no private sector has come in to take over those.
Okay, Shoumitro, is there since you all study different agricultural produce, different local markets, different state markets, was there any illustration that you thought was scalable to try and achieve, to some extent at least, what these central laws seek to achieve, right? Was there anything, what is the fix here? Because otherwise we're back to the earlier system, which was producing reform, but at a very, very slow pace.
I think you gave the answer when you started the show by saying that we write in the report that there are no low-hanging fruits. I think the right question to ask is why isn't investment happening? Why isn't private sector entering? Is it regulation or is it something else? And I feel that the answer to that question if there is one big lesson from the study, it is that states in India are very, very, very different when it comes to their own evolution of the agricultural and the marketing systems and the way kind of the supply chains look right now. And therefore, the answers to that question will also be different, and therefore different states might need a different solution. So,
is it possible also, Shoumitro, is it possible that at the retail end also, which is the end consumer end, there is so much fragmentation? We haven't really reached a set, a sort of a phase of scale when it comes to some of the large grocery chains. I know ITC, sort of procures at a large scale. Maybe Godrej does, but there are only a handful of such players. Maybe at the retail end, that market in itself is not big enough and vibrant enough to finally then streamline the entire supply chain. Is that a fair way of understanding this?
So you're right, and then again we have to ask that why is that not happening? And another sort of, and we point this out in the report as well. Another lesson for us is that one reason why what is happening in agriculture, the answer to that might actually not lie in agriculture but elsewhere. So if you if you think about the very small farmer, even the median farmer, there are serious limits to how much income growth can you get them by regulation or even by entry of the private sector. Because if I am a 2-acre farmer, even if I get kind of the best yields in the world, given that consumers are never going to pay exorbitant prices for food, there are automatic limits to what my best income can be. And then is the story, so how do you get scale? You basically then need to create jobs out of agriculture so that they willingly, I don't think anybody sort of doing farming because they get benefits or subsidies. It's more because there aren't better things to do in the economy. And sort of this is some of my other research with Arvind Subramanian. And that also applies on the retail end, right? So if you don't have a consumer base that is willing to go to supermarkets and pay that premium, then those supermarkets would not come up. Of course, when there are, so even in tier 2 cities like Lucknow, when there are people who are willing to pay that premium to go to a air-conditioned store and buy tomatoes from there as opposed to your local Redibala, those things come up and they will set up their own supply chains. And again, we have to remember that when the private sector develops its supply chain or even storage facilities, they gain. But the real question is whether they will share some of that surplus with the producers. And if I might point to some of the evidence, and this is now completely outside the report, but if I might point out to some of the evidence from across the world, there is no smoking gun evidence. There is research recently in Kenya where entry of agribusinesses has not helped farmers because the increase in surplus was all sort of kept by the agribusinesses. The distress in the dairy sector in the United States is well known. So you have to create conditions under which when sort of scale up happens and there is an increase in the surplus, a part of that surplus is shared with the farmers. And when that happens, that is when you will see increase in farm incomes.
Okay, I'm almost at the end of my time, so I want to put one last question to both of you, and it's going to be a longish question so I can get all of your wrap-up thoughts in it, but we haven't really spoken about the farmer protests, right? And I think some of the conversation that we've had goes to the heart of, why some of these farmers are protesting. But one of the key areas, Shoumitro, that you all talk about in the study, and you've written about, both of you have written about as well, is the issue of, risk, and why the farmers, especially paddy, rice and wheat farmers, aren't shifting away from these crops. Given the ecological concerns around concentration of these farmers within these crops, they're not shifting away because there is no risk mitigation in any of the other crops. Can you link for me how you view these protests, the learnings that you've seen from the study? Sorry, ambitious question. And finally, what you might think could be the next steps towards the solution.
I think a lot of the protests that you're seeing is also just a result of anxieties, because nobody actually made the effort to sit down with the farmers and sort of convey to them what the vision was. So let's suppose that you had all the right intentions and the laws would in fact work in the way that they are supposed to work. You never sat down with the farmers and explained to them how this is going to work.
But the argument is that this is being discussed for 2 decades now, and the farmers should have seen it coming.
I don't understand what you mean by farmers should have seen it coming, because there's a huge trust deficit. So let's start with one of the key government programs, which is procurement at MSP. And what gets highlighted from our study is that there's a huge discrepancy in how much support farmers get even under that program. You talk about the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, which is again supposed to mitigate risk, and you see very low enrollment of farmers even in that program. So in support systems that the government has promised to the farmers already, you don't see even sort of a near perfect delivery. I mean, we are far from there, and so there's a huge trust deficit. That will the government do what it has promised to do for the last 40 years? So come to the issue of risk, right? So we write in the report there are 2 or 3 sort of big forms of risk. So one, the most commonly understood, is the yield risk, right? So I grow my crop, there might be weather shocks, the crops might die from disease and so on. And that is the only type of risk that the government even tries to mitigate through the Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana. But that is not the only form of risk that they are facing, because the other big component is the price risk. And price risk can be either market-induced or can be policy-induced. So the market-induced component is, I grow my crop today, when the harvest will occur for 4 or 5 months from now, I have to have some guess of what that price might be. And that is one of the factors when I make my crop choice. Of course, there is no guarantee that I would get that price. World over, governments provide various sort of risk mitigation instruments, including price loss coverage. So in 2019, the US spent $2 billion just ensuring price loss coverage, which is there is an expected market price and the realized price is much below that expected price, and farmers need to be insured for that. Now, on top of that, there is also policy-induced price risk, right? So, I mean, actually, in the week when the farm laws were announced, we also put an export ban of onions. And that was because international prices were going high, and you wanted, rightly so, you wanted to protect consumers from inflation. So you institute an export ban. But of course, what that means for farmers is that they lose an opportunity to make a profit when they can. And that is completely artificial, like that's policy induced. Again, the US spends a lot of money to insure farmers from policy induced price risks. And we don't. So there are all these different forms of risk that the farmer is facing. They're obviously risk averse, and they are trying to deal with it in the best way they can. I mean, if you don't have access to any instrument, you are borrowing in times of distress, and then you're getting trapped in debt, and therefore you're in poverty and you're not able to scale up. When you do have access to public procurement, that becomes a key form of ensuring risk. And then I switch towards just growing those crops. So Punjab, Haryana is well known, but in MP, you saw farmers switching from various kind of pulses into wheat once the wheat procurement started in 2008. And when you don't have even that, farmers switch to growing the crop which has the lowest risk. And in most cases, that turns out to be rice for various reasons. So rice is a very robust crop. So if you go to the field, everybody will tell you it's a very heat crop. Even if you have some extra rainfall or if you have mild droughts, you will get something. And in the worst case, whatever output there is, even if the supply chain fails, I can at least store it and eat it, right? And risk, I mean, India, there is no talk of, mitigating risk from owning livestock. So if we have to crack this problem of diversification into going to high value crops, we also have to somehow come up with a plan that mitigates risk overall.
Okay, I think you've given us sort of a broad view of what are some of the things these laws should have maybe attempted to address. So Mekhala, I'll give the last couple of minutes to you on what could be a resolution at this stage. And I'm not talking about a political resolution. There might be political issues with regards to the farmers' protest, but many of their concerns are genuine and they need to be addressed. What could be the best way to go about doing that from your end?
Yeah, I think their concerns are deeply genuine and diverse. They've come together in a moment of acute anxiety, as Shoumitro said. But also, I think it's very important, we think about the agriculture sector as something we invest a lot in, both over-regulate as well as provide a lot of finance and subsidies to. However, for most farmers, and that we see this palpably in this study, are really left to their own devices. And farmers operate in India with a very good sense of the deferment of promises, right? Things that you say you will give them, but you don't for a very long time. However, the withdrawal of promises produces acute anxiety. And I think what happened with these laws was the sense of a withdrawal of the systems of support that you have been giving them poorly, that they're still waiting for to arrive, but that you would. So I think that trust deficit comes from experience, right? And realizing how difficult it is to. I want to point out where we have had agricultural transformation in this country. And there are many lessons we have learned from the Green Revolution, that one size doesn't fit all, the focus on cereal centricity, the resource extraction. But I do want to remind you that the Green Revolution did not have a law. It was a public investment. And it was a massive coordinated investment. It was an investment in science. It was an investment in extension services, in building better marketing systems and infrastructure. And all of that came together, right, to lead to certain kinds of transformation. The same thing happened in Madhya Pradesh in the 1980s. Everywhere you see this kind of transformation, it is a result of coordinated action where both public sector and then that brings in private sector investments, right? So I don't think the law is the way forward. What is very, very important is for greater, imagination and vision for agriculture. In the last budget, agriculture was mentioned early on in the budget, but it did not find a mention even once in the section on the economy. It is not treated as an economic sector, as a driver and a multiplier of change, which requires well-directed public investments in infrastructure, in credit, giving credit not only to farmers, but also to all the agri-business and small-scale agri-enterprise. We talk about producer companies. We need to invest both financially and institutionally in strengthening those institutions. And we need to bring in public infrastructure. Private sector will come. This is an overwhelmingly private industry. So I think having a greater vision for agriculture, and this is a vision that cannot be realized without the states, and it cannot be realized without stakeholders. So I think unless we go back to those principles, understand what the sector is all about, and understand it is the largest sector of employment, and when agriculture does well, poverty reduction will do well. It will be a multiplier. And as Shoumitro says, diversification will happen from a position of strength because it must happen, right? But what we want to see is surplus sustained diversification of the economy in India. And for that, we need to keep agriculture at the center and take it seriously as a sector.
All right, I'm going to thank the two of you. I know I've only captured maybe 10 or 20% of the insights that your report actually sets out. It's fascinating in its detail, in its micro understanding of some of these markets. So those of you, who are viewing and who would like to understand this better, please to read the report. It's also populated with some great charts, that sort of bring alive the story of agriculture. Thank you, Mekhala, and thank you, Shoumitro, for joining us here on BloombergQuint and throwing some light on this very complex issue that for the last few months in India, we're trying to distill down into a for or against debate. And thanks to all of you for watching this conversation.
Thank you very much.